I keep a livery at Hawes Crossing, and I have buried more good horses than most men ever own. So when I tell you the smallest person ever to drive the Sablon High Road was a widow who came up off the noon stage with one carpetbag and a boy by the hand, you can believe I'd watched enough come and go to know the ones who'd last. I did not think she'd last a week. That is the truth, and I'm an old man past lying about the times I judged wrong. She stepped down into a January that had the river half froze and the whole town smelling of wood smoke and mule, and she could not have stood 5'2" in her boots. The undertaker had her husband already, laid out cold in the back of Prout's place, where they kept the dead through the hard months until the ground would take them, and half of Hawes Crossing knew that before she did. Tom Mabry had gone off Devers Spur with a loaded wagon 11 days before, him and 4 mules and 3,000 pounds of camp stores, and they'd brought up what the rocks left of him in a wool blanket. So when his widow came up the street asking for the freight office, men got quiet the way men do when they know a thing a woman doesn't. I was the one had to tell her. The freight office was the front room of my livery in those days. Tom rented the desk off me, and she came in out of the cold with the boy and set her bag down and said, plain as church, "I'm Mrs. Mabry. I've come for my husband's business." "Ma'am," I said. I had my hat in my hands before I rightly knew I'd taken it off. "Mrs. Mabry, I'm awful sorry. Did nobody?" "They told me at the stage," she said. Her voice didn't break. That was the first thing about her that surprised me, and it would not be the last. "I'd like to see him, and then I'd like to see the books." The boy was maybe 10, all elbows and big eyes, and he looked up at her when she said the books, and I understood that whatever grief was in her she was holding it back of her teeth for his sake. I took them to Prout's myself. She stood over Tom a long while with her hand on the blanket and her lips moving, and the boy cried, and she didn't, and when she was done she straightened her back like a thing being decided and said, "Now the books, Mr. Prentice." So I showed her the books. Tom Mabry, God keep him, had been a hopeful man and a poor one. He'd had one real asset, and it was the only thing in that ledger worth the ink, a freight contract with the Quill Camp Mining Company, up the tallows past Devers Spur, to carry their stores and their ore down through the season. It was a good contract. It was the best contract out of Hawes Crossing, because it was the worst road out of Hawes Crossing, and no other freighter would touch the spur after the first snow at the price the company paid, which tells you what the company thought of the men it could get. Tom had signed it because he was new and brave and didn't know any better, and it had killed him in his first winter. "There's a clause," I told her, because I'm honest even when honesty's a coward's way out. "Company can call the contract void if a delivery's missed. Camp's near 300 souls up there, and the pass closes hard by February. They got maybe 9 weeks of stores. They'll need 3 more runs before the road shuts, or they don't eat. And if you can't make the runs, the company gives the contract to whoever can, and you've got nothing." I closed the ledger. "Mrs. Mabry, there's men in this town been driving mules 30 years won't take the spur loaded after a snow. I'd not say it to be unkind. I'd say it so you'll sell the contract while it's worth something and take your boy somewhere with a roof." She looked at me with eyes the gray of river ice, and she said, "What's it worth?" "Skeel'd give you a fair price." Ord Skeel ran the only other freight outfit in town, 6 wagons and a mean streak, and he'd been after the Quill contract for 2 years. "He'd take it off your hands today." "Then it's worth a good deal," she said, "if a man like that wants it." And she set her small hand flat on the closed ledger like she was laying claim to land. "I'm not selling my husband's business 11 days after he died so the man who wants it most can have it cheap. I'm going to drive it." I've run that moment back through my head 1,000 times in the years since, and I have never once been able to find the place where I should have laughed and didn't. By rights I ought to have. She didn't know a single tree from a stay chain. She'd never thrown a diamond hitch nor doubled a team on a grade nor read whether coming off the tallows the way you have to or it reads you. She was a widow with a child and a dead man's debts and a road that ate experienced men. But I'd buried a lot of horses, like I said, and you learn to tell the ones with bottom from the ones with just a pretty gait. Something in the way she'd stood over Tom and not wept, something in the way her hand lay on that book. I didn't laugh. I said, "Well, you'll want to meet your mules." Word was through Hawes Crossing by supper that the Mabry widow meant to drive the Quill Road herself, and by the next morning it was a joke in both saloons and a wager at the Mercantile. I know because I was at the Mercantile. Ord Skeel stood by the stove with his thumbs in his vest and laughed loud enough to be heard at the door, and said the only thing she'd haul over the spur was herself, in a box, by Easter, same as her fool husband. The men around him laughed because Skeel was the kind of man you laughed with, so he didn't turn it on you. Old Dover, the harness maker, put $1 on her lasting one trip. 3 men covered it. The mood of the place was the mood of men who have decided a thing is funny and have not yet been shamed out of it. There was one man at the back of the store who didn't laugh, and that was Boone Hartley. You'd not have noticed him if you didn't know to look. He ran the bar out past the river bend, cattle and a string of good mules, and he came to town maybe twice a month and said about 40 words while he was there. He was a big man gone quiet, the way some big men do, and there was a grief on him that the town had stopped asking about because the answer was hard. He'd had a wife, Ellen, and a little girl, and they'd been coming back over the lower river road in a wagon 4 years before when the spring melt took the ford out from under them. And Boone had pulled his wife from the Sablon 2 miles down and never found the child at all. After that he'd sold off half his herd and let the rest of his life go quiet and hard, and he drove his own freight for the camp now, and then in the good months, alone. Because a man alone in a wagon doesn't have to make conversation about what he's lost. I was standing near him when Skeel got the room laughing about the box and Easter, and I saw Boone Hartley's jaw go tight. And he set down the coffee he'd been holding and walked out without buying what he'd come for. I followed him onto the porch because I'm nosy and old and have earned the right. "You don't think it's funny?" I said. Boone looked off down the street to where you could just see the freight office. "My Ellen drove a team better than most men in there," he said. "Folks laughed at that too." He pulled his hat down. "Road don't care if you laugh at it. It killed Tom Mabry and he was a man they respected. It'll kill her the same or it won't, and the laughing's got nothing to do with which." Then he said the thing I have always remembered, because it was the longest run of words I'd heard out of him in a year. "If she's fool enough to try it, she'll need somebody to show her honest instead of laughing or robbing her. Skeel'll do both." And he got on his horse and rode home, and I thought that was the end of his part in it, and I was wrong about that too. She came to me the next day at first light and said she wanted to learn her stock, and so I taught her her mules. I will tell you they were not easy mules. Tom had bought cheap and bred for nothing, and the off-leader was a black devil named Solomon that had put 2 men in the dirt. But she went in among them slow, with her sleeves rolled and that ice-gray steadiness, and she did not flinch when Solomon laid his ears flat, and she did not coo at him like a town woman either. She watched him. She learned where his feet were, and where his teeth were, and she made him learn she'd stand there all day. By the 3rd morning she could harness the wheelers alone. By the end of the week she could throw a hitch that wouldn't shame a green teamster, and she'd skinned both her hands raw doing it and never said a word about the blood. The boy, his name was Sam, helped where he could and stayed out from under the hooves where he couldn't, and she taught him too, because she decided he was going to grow up knowing how to do hard things instead of being told he couldn't. She was not, I want to be plain, a natural at it. That's the part the town would later make into a tale, that she had some born gift, and it cheapens what she did. She was clumsy and slow, and she made every mistake there was to make. She rolled a wagon empty on a dry flat the 2nd week and bruised her whole left side black. She loaded wrong and lost a wheel. She trusted a strap that anyone with 10 years would have eyed, and it parted on her and dropped 100 weight of flour in the road. What she had was not gift. What she had was that she got up every single time, counted what the mistake had cost, and did not make it twice. I have known that to be rarer than gift and worth 10 times as much. Skeel watched all this with his thumbs in his vest and his patience running thin, because every day she didn't quit was a day his cheap contract walked further off. So Skeel started helping things along. What Skeel did was small and mean and legal, the way a careful man's cruelty usually is. He went to the company's agent who came down from Quill Camp twice a season, a soft, nervous fellow named Holly's Vane, and he put it in Vane's ear that the Mabry outfit was finished, that a widow couldn't make the runs, and that the company would be smart to void the dead man's contract now rather than wait for 300 miners to go hungry on a technicality. Vane was the kind of man who'd believe whoever spoke to him last and loudest, and Skeel made sure he spoke last. So Wren got a letter, carried down by a company rider, that said the contract would be reviewed at the end of January, and that if the outfit appeared unable to guarantee delivery, it would be reassigned. It did not say reassigned to Skeel. It didn't have to. She brought the letter to me because I could read the company's lawyer talk better than she could, and she stood while I read it with her hands folded and her face still, and when I finished she said only, "How long to the end of January?" 2 weeks and some. "And how many runs in that time, to show I can?" "1 run over the spur loaded there and back," I said, "and there's not a man would call you finished after that. But Wren," I'd taken to her Christian name by then, "the way you do with someone you've come to respect against your own expectations. The weather's turning. There's snow on the high tallows already and more coming. A loaded run over the spur in the next 2 weeks is the very thing Tom died trying. Vane's giving you a test he expects to kill you." "Then it's a good thing," she said, "that I don't have to pass it alone." I didn't know what she meant until Boone Hartley rode in that afternoon. He'd heard about the letter half the town had. Skeel saw to that, and he came to the freight office and stood in the door with his hat in his hand, which I'd never once seen him do, and he said, "Mrs. Mabry, I run freight for the camp myself, the lower contract, the easy months. I know the spur." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'd drive it with you, not for you. With you, second wagon, my team and my load on the company's books separate. So it's your run and your contract and your name on it, but you're not on that road alone with green mules and a boy. That's all. You'd owe me nothing." I have seen a good many men offer a woman help in my time, and most of them are really offering to take a thing over while calling it help. That was not what Boone Hartley offered, and Wren heard the difference, because she was a woman who'd learned the hard way to listen for it. He didn't offer to drive her wagon. He offered to drive his own beside hers, so the road would have 2 of them to kill instead of 1. He left her the reins of her own life and only asked to share the danger. She was quiet a moment, then she said, "Why?" And Boone Hartley, who said 40 words a month, said, "Because my wife could drive better than the men who laughed at her, and the river took her anyway, and I have spent 4 years thinking there was nothing left I could have done. Maybe there wasn't." He looked at her steady. "But there's something I can do here, so I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me." She let him. I want to tell you about the 2 weeks that followed, because the town would later remember only the run, the way folks always remember the lightning and forget the long building of the storm. But the run was the easy part, in a way. The 2 weeks were where it was earned. He came every day from the bar an hour's ride each way, and he taught her the road without ever once making her feel taught. He'd say, "Ellen used to ride the brake going into the spur switchbacks rather than the wheel lock, said the lock skidded you on the ice, you might try it," and let her find out he was right. He showed her how to read the tallows for weather, the way the clouds sat on the peaks, the smell that came down ahead of snow. He went over her harness and found 3 places it'd fail and didn't shame her for them, just mended them and showed her why. He brought a spare set of his own good mules and lent her the leaders, quiet seasoned animals that would steady her green ones on the grade. And when she tried to bargain a price for the loan, he said the price was that she'd lend him a hand at branding come spring, and so made it a trade between equals instead of charity. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, I watched it happen from my livery door and said nothing, because an old man knows when to keep his mouth shut. Somewhere in there the 2 of them stopped being a widow and the man helping her and became something neither had a name for yet. It was in small things. It was in the way he started staying for the supper Sam helped her cook, and the way the boy took to riding out to meet him on the road. It was in the way her face changed when his horse came over the bend, not softer exactly, but less braced, like a person setting down a weight they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it was a weight. It was in the way he talked more, a little more each day, 4 years of quiet thawing one careful sentence at a time. Neither of them said a word of it. They were both people who'd been hurt too hard to say a thing before they were sure of it. But I saw it, and so did Sam, and so, God help us, did Ord Skeel. Skeel came to the freight office 3 days before the run. He didn't laugh this time. A man stops laughing when the joke starts coming true. "Heard Hartley's driving with you," he said. "2 wagons, cozy." He let that sit ugly. You think one widow and one half-broke rancher who can't get over his dead wife make a freight outfit. You'll lose a wagon on the spur and maybe both, and then the camp's short and the contract's mine anyway, only you'll have killed Hartley too. That what you want? Another man dead on that road on your account. I saw the blow land. It was meant to. Skeel had found the one thing she feared more than her own death, that her stubbornness would cost someone else. She went pale, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stage, I saw her steadiness crack. But Boone was there in the corner mending a trace, and he stood up slow and said, "Skeel." Just the name. And then, "I've already lost the people the road and the river meant to take from me. Nobody's deciding what I'm worth risking but me. You've made your bet she'll fail. You're welcome to it. Now get off her floor." Skeel got, but he left the fear behind him on purpose, and that night Wren came to the livery where I was forking down hay and stood in the lantern light a long time before she said, "Eli, if I'm wrong, if I get him killed proving I can do a thing I maybe can't." "Wren," I said, and I set down the fork. "Listen to an old man. That fella has been dead 4 years and walking around it. I've watched him. The only time I've seen the live part of him come back up is these 2 weeks driving a hard road beside you. You're not risking his life. You're the first thing in 4 years that's made him want one." I picked the fork back up because I'm not a man for long speeches, and I'd surprised myself. "Drive your run. He'll drive his. And the 2 of you'll either come down off that mountain together or you won't, but you'll not have done it to him. He chose it. Let a man choose." She stood there. Then she nodded, once, the way she'd nodded over Tom's body when she decided to live, and she went back to her boy. The snow came the night before they were to leave, which was the worst luck and also the only chance, because Vane's deadline gave no room to wait it out. They loaded in the black dark of a January morning, the whole town abed except the few of us who'd come down to see it, me, and Dover the harness maker who'd bet against her and had come, I think, half-hopping to lose his dollar, and Calvin Reed, a young teamster who'd thrown in with Wren when no one else would, and was to drive the 3rd wagon they'd added for the camp's flour. 3 wagons. Wren on the lead, Boone behind her, Calvin at the rear. Sam stayed with me, white-faced, and did not cry, because his mother had taught him that hard things are done with a still face and got back from afterward. I won't pretend I saw the run. No one in town did. But I had it after from Boone and from Calvin and from the camp men who came down later, and I've put it together the way you put together a thing you wish you'd witnessed. They went up the Sablon road in the dark with the snow coming sideways, and they made the foot of Devers Spur by mid-morning with the storm full on them. The spur is a shelf road, you understand, a track cut into the mountainside, rock wall on the one hand and a drop of 400 feet on the other, switchbacking up to the pass, and in summer it's only frightening. In a blizzard, loaded, it's the thing that killed Tom Mabry and would have killed most men who tried it that day. The wind came off the drop in gusts that staggered the mules. The track iced under the snow, and a third of the way up on the worst of the switchbacks, Wren's green off-leader, not Solomon, she'd learned him by then, but a young mule she'd not had time to season, spooked at a sheet of ice sliding off the rock above and lunged, and her lead wagon slewed toward the edge. This is the part the town made a legend of, and the legend's wrong, so I'll tell it true. The legend says Boone Hartley leapt from his wagon and saved her, He didn't. He couldn't have reached her in time, and he knew it. What happened was that Ren Mabry, in the half-second she had, did the thing he'd taught her, and the thing her own 2 weeks of falling down and getting up had built into her hands. She rode the brake, not the lock, threw her weight to the inside rein, and talked that terrified mule down off its panic with a voice I'm told never once rose, while the wagon's outside wheel ran the very lip of the drop and held. She saved herself. Boone, coming up behind, saw the whole thing and said later it was the worst 10 seconds of his life and the proudest, because there was not one thing he could do but watch her not need him. She brought her team back to the center of the track, and she sat there a moment shaking, and then she lifted her hand to Boone to say she was whole, and they drove on, up through the pass in the screaming white, down the far side into the bowl where Quill Camp huddled with 9 days of stores left and 300 men who'd been told no freight was coming till spring. They came in at dusk through snow to the mules' knees, 3 wagons, the widow in the lead, and the camp turned out into the storm to watch them come, and a thing happened that those camp men talked about for years after. Nobody cheered. They were too struck for it. They just took off their hats, 300 hard men in a blizzard. For a small woman on a freight wagon who had done the thing they'd been told couldn't be done. They wintered the camp. Ren made 2 more runs before the pass closed for good, and Boone drove beside her on both, and by the third the green mule was green no longer, and neither was she. Holly's Vane, who'd come up to the camp to oversee the reassignment of a dead man's contract, instead sat in the company office and signed the renewal across the desk to a widow with chapped hands and ice-gray eyes, in her own name, Mabry Freight, because there was no longer any honest way to pretend she couldn't do the work. Skeel lost his bet and is standing both. A town will forgive a man much, but not being wrong out loud about a thing it then watches come true. Folks stopped laughing with him at the stove. Old Dover paid out his $1 to the 3 who'd covered it and told me he'd never spent $1 happier. And Boone Hartley and Ren Mabry, well, it wasn't a sudden thing, and I'll not make it one. They'd both buried too much to come at it any way but careful. But the spring she'd promised him a hand at branding, she came out to the Bar H with Sam, and somewhere between the branding and the haying she stopped going home of an evening. And that fall there was a quiet wedding at the crossing with me standing up for Boone, because he had no one else, and the boy standing up for his mother. She kept the freight line in her own name. Boone never once asked her to fold it into his, and she loved him the more for never asking. And they ran 2 outfits off the one place, his cattle and her wagons, and Mabry Freight drove the Quill Road every season after with the best teams in the tallows and never lost another load. I am an old man now, and most of what I've told you is 30 years gone. Boone's passed these 6 years, Ren a year behind him, the 2 of them worn down together to the end the way good harness wears, side by side. Sam runs the line now and runs it well, and named his first girl Ellen, which made Boone weep the one time I ever saw it, near the end. But I think on that first morning often. A widow off the noon stage, 5'2", with a dead man's debts and a road that ate men, and a whole town betting her a box by Easter. They were wrong, every one of them but the quiet rancher who never doubted her and the old fool liveryman who couldn't say why he didn't laugh. She drove the mountain. She did it with her own 2 hands, and the man who loved her had the rare good sense to drive beside her and never once in front. That's the whole of it. That's the truest thing I know. We drive at dawn, he told her that first cold morning, and they did. For 30 years they did. It wasn't a sudden thing, and I'll not make it one. They'd both buried too much to come at it any way but careful. But the spring she'd promised him a hand at branding, she came out to the Bar H with Sam, and somewhere between the branding and the haying she stopped going home of an evening. And that fall there was a quiet wedding at the crossing with me standing up for Boone, because he had no one else, and the boy standing up for his mother. She kept the freight line in her own name. Boone never once asked her to fold it into his, and she loved him the more for never asking. And they ran 2 outfits off the one place, his cattle and her wagons, and Mabry Freight drove the Quill Road every season after with the best teams in the tallows and never lost another load. I am an old man now, and most of what I've told you is 30 years gone. Boone's passed these 6 years, Wren a year behind him, the two of them worn down together to the end the way good harness wears, side by side. Sam runs the line now and runs it well, and named his first girl Ellen, which made Boone weep the one time I ever saw it, near the end. But I think on that first morning often. A widow off the noon stage, 5'2", with a dead man's debts and a road that ate men, and a whole town betting her a box by Easter. They were wrong, every one of them but the quiet rancher who never doubted her and the old fool liveryman who couldn't say why he didn't laugh. She drove the mountain. She did it with her own 2 hands, and the man who loved her had the rare good sense to drive beside her and never once in front. That's the whole of it. That's the truest thing I know. We drive at dawn, he'd told her that first cold morning, and they did. For 30 years they did.